The Mandalorian Season 3, Episode 7, Chapter 23, The Spies. We've arrived at the penultimate episode, and it's finally time for this show to get down to the business of what this season's supposed to be all about. It opens up on Coruscant. We're following Elia Kane, the former Imperial officer who's been kind of slowly working her way up the bureaucratic ranks in the New Republic. But this time, instead of being up above where all the elite and the people running society are, she's down at the bottom level, walking along the streets, and she ends up going into a back alley. And there we find a probe droid, and she gives it a code, and we get Moff Gideon finally appearing in this season. He shows up on a hologram image. And what I like about this scene is we learn that the pirates who came to Navarro to try to attack it and seize control of that port weren't doing that just because they were pirates. They were apparently doing that under orders from Moff Gideon, hired by Gideon and his people to do this. Navarro seems to be a very critical logistical piece of whatever plan Moff Gideon and these other remnants of the Empire are kind of formulating. There's something going on in that part of the outer galaxy that has been hinted at throughout the season. Having a burgeoning, thriving, trade port being established seems to be something that is going to really significantly negatively impact whatever is going on out here. So, which explains then why Moff Gideon and whoever else he's connected to has been behind trying to undo the work that Greef Karga has been accomplishing there. Elia Kane relays this information to Moff Gideon and lets her know that it wasn't the New Republic who came to Navarro's aid. She made sure to kind of take care of that. It was the Mandalorians who helped them, and not just Mandalorians, but the very same Mandalorians who were the ones who captured and imprisoned him initially. So we switch POVs. Now we're with Moff Gideon, and Elia Kane is on the hologram. And Gideon vows to take care of it. And that meeting ends, and then we stay with Moff Gideon. And he's on some Imperial base somewhere. He leaves the chamber he was in, goes down and around like a corner, and there's a whole series of red energy doors, running down this corridor, with these sort of Imperial, First Order looking stormtroopers, 2 in each little bay. Now, this seems to be there because it's something that's cool looking. It's kind of a throwback to a similar kind of thing in The Phantom Menace that Obi-Wan got stuck in trying to get to Qui-Gon Jinn fighting Darth Maul. So it's something along that lines, though it doesn't seem to be on any sort of timer like those were. These are just doors. And for me, it reminded me of the old sort of spy spoof show, Get Smart, where this is what you have to do to get into the main headquarters. Except there, each kind of set of doors is made with a different design and opens and closes a different way. And it's just, the silliness of going through all these things just to walk into an office. And that's really what Moff Gideon is doing here. So I don't know if they intended to remind people of the Get Smart show, but that's just what came to mind for me. But cool little throwback, sort of esque, to the Phantom Menace sort of style of thinking or presentation. After finally making its way through this series of energy doors, Moff Gideon comes into another chamber where there's another meeting of a bunch of hologram people happening already. We learn in this meeting that the Imperial people are a lot more organized and a lot more, or perhaps coordinated might be a better word, in all the various things they're doing. Some of these people in this meeting look to be people who are placed in higher positions of authority in the New Republic themselves. Others, you can tell by their dress, are not in any kind of inner circle or inner power. They're out in different parts of the galaxy, and they're all trying to just kind of do what they need to do, but not in any way that connects them to each other for the New Republic to start to realize that it's a coordinated movement happening. They're trying to make it just look like individual sort of low-level petty warlords in different areas with their own little factions, just causing localized trouble. But in reality, what we're seeing here is the early stages of, again, what presumably will become the First Order later on. And we have a couple of really cool, like, Easter eggs here in this scene. We have Commandant Hux, one of the people in this meeting, and he apparently is the father of the Hux from the sequel trilogy. So it was pretty cool to see his father here and having these kind of character and familial connections to characters that come later on. And the bigger Easter egg is we get Captain Pellaeon. This is Moff Gideon's, like, kind of right-hand guy, the guy who captains, like, Moff Gideon's kind of flagship. We heard his voice, I believe, in Star Wars Rebels, because he was the Imperial captain running the blockade of Lothal in that series during that whole kind of final story arc. So this is our first time getting a live-action Captain Pellaeon, which is pretty cool, because they've been slowly laying the ground for the arrival of Grand Admiral Thrawn throughout this season, even last season, really, when we had Ahsoka show up. She's the one who's like, where's Grand Admiral Thrawn? And they've been, throughout this season, putting little kind of pieces in place that give you an indication that there's something bigger happening here. And in this case, we're moving towards, finally, the return of Grand Admiral Thrawn from this sort of other dimension he got trapped in. We're not going to be getting Admiral Thrawn in this season. I was hoping that we would get, like, maybe like the final end credit shot of season 3 would be a Thrawn cameo, but we had the Ahsoka, like, teaser trailer come out recently at the Star Wars Celebration event in London, and there was a shot of Thrawn, the back of Thrawn's head, walking away from the camera. And once you saw that in that little teaser trailer, that means, okay, we're not getting a shot of Thrawn in this season 3 Mandalorian here. It's obvious now that they're saving the actual reveal of Thrawn for the Ahsoka series, which generally makes sense. Gideon doesn't seem all that impressed about Grand Admiral Thrawn's, like, plans or desires. All he knows, even though he's kind of been following along with them, whatever they might be, all he knows is he keeps being told Grand Admiral Thrawn's back, he's supposed to be in these meetings, and yet he never shows up in any of these meetings. Captain Pellaeon speaks for him, but from Moff Gideon's perspective, it's like, do you really speak for him? Or are you just name-dropping him to get what you want? Because I have things that I need to do, and you, Pellaeon and Hux, you're the ones gathering all the weapons, all the money, all the power, and I'm out here doing the work, and I need the resources that I need. And I sent you my list of what I need, so we got to get this done. And he's like, maybe it's time for new leadership here. So, because you guys can't get it done if this guy's not going to show up, and you guys can't get done what needs to get done, maybe we need to rethink who should be in charge. Now, it turns out Gideon has been asking for more TIE bombers, more TIE interceptors. He wants 3 Praetorian guards for himself. So he's like, his list of requests is getting larger and larger, speaking not only to him making power moves that the others are all kind of worried will expose all their connections to each other, but they're also like 3 Praetorian guards, getting a little full of yourself kind of thing. But he explains that the Mandalorians are now becoming a problem. He knows that they plan on going to Mandalore and reestablishing their community, their culture, their people there. And right away you can see the reaction from Pellaeon and the others. It's like, that can't be allowed to happen. And I should have realized right then why that was the reaction they all had, because why would anyone really care? If the Mandalorians went back to Mandalore, it's a small group of fanatics, they would have so much work to do there just to plant crops so they could really maintain any kind of real presence there. So I should have put 2 and 2 together about where Moff Gideon and this base he's in might be, but I didn't make the connection until, we get the reveal later. But anyway, as soon as he tells them that, they're like, okay, you can have your bombers and your interceptors and your Praetorian guards. Take care of the problem. So overall, I really like this opening scene. We're finally getting down to the point of season 3, because Moff Gideon has been this series' main antagonist. He really has since day one. He's been the primary antagonist of this show. So 7 episodes into an 8-episode season, it's nice to finally have the man show back up on screen again. And it was a really well done scene, because we now get our first look at it's not just Moff Gideon kind of running his own little show out here. He's a piece of a much larger puzzle. We see the infighting and the maneuvering for power and control and influence among even this small group of Imperials. And that's juxtaposed already with this already sort of setting in malaise of lazy bureaucracy in the New Republic. They're already just falling into these sort of monotonous roles and not really thinking for threats and dangers. They seem to think, we're victorious, we won. Emperor's gone, the Jedi guy, overthrew them, and we can kind of just settle down, take our time, figure things out, do it right. Not thinking, because when you just get thrown into, here, file these 75 million pages in this complicated order, your window of what you're looking at just narrows down to this such a small thing. There's too many people siloed down into these individual buckets, and we don't know what is happening on the higher levels of this New Republic. If there's any type of system even in place yet that can take information out of all these little siloed things and start collating them into seeing a coherent picture of what threats and issues and problems might be kind of popping up around the galaxy. We haven't seen that part of the New Republic yet. We've been getting like little components of like different facets on Coruscant, but we haven't really been spending time with the New Republic leadership for the most part here. This is one of the things I've actually liked about this season. In seeing some of like the mid-level sort of bureaucracy, it's mirroring in some ways what we got in season 1 of Andor, because I thought they did a really good job showing that sort of mid-level bureaucracy in the Empire in that season, not really catching that the rebellion was becoming an actual legitimate serious threat. We're seeing something similar here where we're getting glimpses of that sort of mid-level bureaucracy on the New Republic side, where they seem to be making some of the same mistakes. But anyway, I don't want to get off too much on a tangent here. I liked this scene where we're now getting, okay, here's some of the main players and pieces that are happening on the Imperial Remnant side. So it's not just a Moff Gideon. It's now, there's a lot of other pieces in place in different areas inside the inner workings of the New Republic and on the outskirts, sort of functioning in sort of like little warlords and things to be able to give themselves a lot more maneuverability and flexibility in getting their hands on things that they might need for later. Now that opening scene out of the way, we are off to Navarro, where we have Bo-Katan and her now restored fleet arriving in the skies above the port and coming down and landing all their ships. And we get our very tense meeting between the Watch and now the Night Owls who have come with Bo and Din. And it's kind of a very standoff where neither group really knows how to even talk to the other, how to even say hello, because they're all looking at each other, and then all the Night Owls take all their helmets off. And then that kind of just ramps up the tension a little bit. And you can already begin to see Axe Woves on the Night Owl side and Paz Vizsla on the Watch side. These are the two alpha males. There's this sort of understanding that's beginning to emerge on both sides that if they're going to find some way forward, it's those two are going to have to figure out a way to bridge that divide between these two very, very different ideological groups. And Bo picks this up right away, and her and Din Djarin kind of both realize it, and Bo does the very smart thing. She's starting to realize, okay, I need to let these two kind of figure their stuff out. However, before like tensions can like hit that next level where somebody might say something really stupid or do something really stupid, the armor clangs her like tools together, breaks the tension, and then invites the Night Owls in for a meal. Kind of like, hey, there are fellow Mandalorians, like as a reminder, we have to start finding a way to put aside our differences because all the Mandalorians need to work together. And she does it just in a simple, like just breaking that tension. Hey everyone, let's eat. sitting down and having a meal is a nice icebreaker in general for any kind of sort of tense like meeting between people where they don't really know how to engage each other yet. And then, because we have to get, Grogu's got to get his little time to do his thing, Din Djarin meets with Grief Karga, and we get IG-12 instead of IG-11. They took IG-11, ripped out his guts, and those little, I forget the name of the little those little guys who were working on him, they built this sort of little driving seat with levers that you can control it. So it becomes kind of like a mech suit or something. And the little guy climbs out, and Grogu is like right in that thing. And it has like 2 buttons where you press one button and it'll say no, and you press another button, it'll say yes. And Din is like, come on, Grogu, get out of there. You can't. And no. He's like, come on, you're too young. You can't handle it. No. And Grief Karga's like, I think he wants to give it a try. I think there's something he can learn. Yes. And then Grogu starts like really poorly trying to control it and learn how to walk around the office in it, bumping into things. Funny, humorous, cute little scene. But it is now Grogu in a sort of mechanized, mechanical suit that gives him some different abilities, I guess, let's say, more physical rather than spiritual force related. We get our next shot where Din Djarin and Grogu are walking through town, Grogu in the suit, because he's a kid, even though he's 50, he's a kid in his species standards. With every step, he's like, yes, 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 as he's walking, which, again, is what a kid would do in that kind of a situation. And he's just like grabbing food from merchants and stuff. And Grogu is good in this sense for sort of that comic relief moments, because I don't know that they really know what to do with him, because their original plan seemed to have been get him to Luke Skywalker so he can go off to become a Jedi, and then Mandalorian's story would take him in a new direction. But since they reversed all that in the Book of Boba Fett and just brought Grogu back, you can see this season they don't really know what to do with the character, because he hasn't really done a whole lot at all this season. Very, very little. There's been a couple of moments, but for the most part, he's just kind of been there. And he's there to kind of ease the tension in his scene a little bit by doing something kind of cute and silly. This is something they really need to correct for season 4. They need to start giving this character a purpose. You had a whole arc for the guy. You accomplished that. Great storyline. Closed out his role. We knew he'd come back to him someday in the future, maybe in a movie or something where we'd see Jedi Master Grogu come onto the scene. And they just decided, we're just going to reverse everything we did for 2 seasons. Undo all of that. And now they don't seem to know what to do with the guy. So they really need to figure out, okay, you brought him back, come up with a reason why that makes sense, that's a compelling story. Because he just kind of sat around this whole season for the most part up to this point. All that out of the way, Bo-Katan gathers everyone together, and she gives kind of a speech as to where it's time for us to return to Mandalore and beginning to reestablish our society. That we have to put aside our ideological differences and come together as a people. And let's start building a new Mandalorian future. And she proposes that they take a scouting team, and the scouting team will go and land and scout the surface and try to just secure the area, make sure that they have a place where they can then later bring everyone down and begin kind of setting up shop. Instead of, however, just the scout team going to Mandalore and doing all of that and then coming back to Navarro to kind of report on what they found and then formulating the next step of this process. Nope, that's not what they do. It's pile every Mandalorian into the whole fleet, and we're all going to go to Mandalore, but we're going to leave the fleet in orbit. So we're going to leave all the rest of the Mandalorians in ships in orbit around Mandalore, and we're going to take one ship and go down to the surface and scout. That seems like the dumbest plan I've ever heard in my life, because you have no idea what's going on out there. Bo-Katan had her family home on the neighboring planet, bombed to smithereens. So really risky to just take your whole society and put them all in ships and in orbit in one spot that's target practice if like an Imperial fleet of some kind actually showed up. But that's one of the negatives of Star Wars under Disney, really. And we see it a bit in this season, where it's not who the characters are and what their personalities are like and their experiences and traumas and everything that lead them to make the choices that they make, which then drive the plot. It's the plot's been pre-decided. This is what we want to happen. So if a character has to make a decision to do something that that character, based upon that character's whole story arc to this date, wouldn't do, we're going to have them do it anyway, because the plot drives the character, not the character driving the plot in this show. This is, again, this is a problem with Disney Star Wars. This is something we've seen in like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, which I don't even want to even open that door of a discussion here in this Mandalorian videos. That's a topic for a whole nother day, because I mean, talk about taking Obi-Wan Kenobi and turning him into the biggest absolute idiot I've ever seen in my entire life. But move on from that. This is what they decided to do. All the Mandalorians in orbit. This group goes down, led by Bo-Katan. You know, they're like, okay, who's going to come down with me? And nobody's moving. And then one of the Night Owls says, I'll go. And then Axe Woves is like, I'll go. And I think maybe a third Night Owl says they'll go. And then Paz Vizsla and some of the Watch start saying, okay, they'll go. So we have a good mixed group from both. And even the Armorer is like, you know, I'll go as well. Even though when they get to orbit, the Armorer actually stays back with the fleet, from what I recall. And it's just Bo-Katan and Din Djarin, Axe Woves, Paz Vizsla, and a combined group of some of both Night Owls and the Watch go down to the surface. Shortly after their arrival on the surface, they know, okay, we've got to figure out, make our way to the Great Forge. We're going to start there and check out the forge, see if we can get it rekindled. Because once we get the forge lit, then, you know, we can start doing blacksmith work and building things we need to build and all that kind of stuff. But as they're kind of standing around, this sort of big ship comes gliding across the like sort of glass smooth surface, because the surface has been like turned to glass in many areas by that massive bombing from the Purge. And it's this big ship, and we see there's Mandalorians on it, and 3 of them like fly off of it and come down and land, and they recognize Bo-Katan immediately, and they apologize to her, saying that, you know, we're sorry we failed you. We discovered that they're Mandalorians who were here during the Purge, survived the Purge, and have been kind of hiding out ever since. So they were cut off from the rest of the Mandalorian society all this time. They didn't know what happened, or how the Purge happened, or why it happened. And from their perspectives, they just lost the war, or failed to win from their eyes. They failed their Bo-Katan and House, I think, Kryze. Is that how you pronounce her last name, if I'm recalling correctly? So they look at themselves as failures to their people. And Bo kind of gathers them all together when they're having a meal, and she starts to tell them what happened and how the Purge came about. Also how Moff Gideon got the Darksaber. There had been that massive war between these Imperial forces and Mandalore, because the Mandalorians were so fractured as a society, fractured off into these different factions. They weren't a united people anymore, and so didn't have the strength to repel Imperial forces. Like, had they been a united people, they're extremely difficult to build. Because, again, if you go back to their past, this is a society that was built upon, you know, fighting and beating Jedi Knights. So Imperial forces would be something a united Mandalore would be able to go toe-to-toe with. But they got to the point where Bo-Katan recognized that they can't win this fight. So she met with Moff Gideon, and they had like sort of a conference, and she agreed. She's like, I'll surrender, sign a surrender agreement. You know, we'll hand our weapons over. And he's like, Darksaber, and I'll hand the Darksaber over. But you will leave our cities and our people alone. What you haven't destroyed up to this point, you will leave all that alone. Let us remain, let us live in peace. That's the deal. And that was what was agreed to. Moff Gideon agreed to it. So she signed that deal, surrendered Mandalore, turned over the Darksaber, and then he immediately basically threw the deal in the garbage and carried out the Purge and just destroyed the planet, bombed all their cities into dust and glass, and killed as many of their people that were still there as possible. So that's how all of this ended up coming about, because Bo-Katan actually put aside her pride to save her people. And unfortunately for her, she was making a deal with the devil, who had no sense of honor or justice, or had no word. He didn't care. He revels in harm and pain and death and destruction. It's just who Moff Gideon is. He's a great villain. But it was a really interesting character moment for Bo-Katan, because her pride has been her biggest flaw as a character. This whole time, from the first day we met her during the Clone Wars series, all the way through, her pride has been her downfall and her people's downfall in many ways. So here, it's interesting to see that she was able to put aside her personal pride and humiliate herself to save her people, which a big growth moment for Bo-Katan as a character overall in this her whole story here that we've been following since the Clone Wars days. I really, really liked that. It explained in a believable way how the Purge could have come about, how the Darksaber could have ever ended up in Moff Gideon's hands. I couldn't have seen him in his earlier days defeating a Mandalorian in hand-to-hand combat and taking that Darksaber away from someone like Bo-Katan. She's just way too skilled a fighter. The Moff Gideon we get here at the end of Season 3, and we'll really see this in the next episode. I filmed my Season 7 and Season 8 reviews and just hated them when I started to review them, so I scrapped them. So I'm recording this review now, having rewatched 7 and 8 again. In the context of what I know is in the next episode, the Moff Gideon we get that they fight here is a very, very leveled up Moff Gideon from the one that Bo-Katan sat across from this negotiating table with years earlier that led to the Purge. That Moff Gideon back then could not have won that hand-to-hand combat fight, but he just brought Mandalore to its knees, and because he had the power to destroy them, and then destroyed them anyway when he got what he wanted. And then we have a really interesting moment here now with from Din Djarin, because this, I think, is a really big eye-opening moment for him as well. Seeing these, particularly these Mandalorians who had been living in hiding on Mandalore ever since the Purge, seeing the respect they had for Bo-Katan when they show up. I think something clicked in Din Djarin's head at that point. She really is this sort of royalty in a sense, that it's not just bravado or ego on her part. She's actually legit. He could see the instant respect these Mandalorians had for her. And even among the Watch, he can see that many of them, they know who she is. Having had the armor give Bo-Katan her proper respect with her station and history and everything, and then seeing these other Mandalorians where they just didn't care about anybody else. They went right to her and kind of pledged themselves to her and apologized and humbled themselves before her. And then she was able to kind of no, it's my fault, not yours. I think this was a big moment for Din Djarin in terms of a little bit of a kind of shift in his mindset about everything he's been experiencing as a Mandalorian himself. Learning more about the divisions that brought Mandalore to its knees, and Bo-Katan kind of admitting in many ways her own responsibility for many of those divisions, and how her pride really helped be a big part of their fall as a people, and her beginning to humble herself here and make herself vulnerable by telling them of her own failures in many ways. I think we get a very interesting moment out of Din Djarin. A shocking moment for me, but now in hindsight, kind of rethinking this whole season, and in particular, all the events here on Mandalore in this episode, from the moment they arrived and those refugees who've been in hiding showed up to this moment. I think it makes more sense to me now in hindsight. But my initial reaction was Din Djarin suddenly turns into Jon Snow and professes his undying loyalty and pledges himself to serve Bo-Katan for the rest of her life, like Jon Snow suddenly pledged himself to Daenerys. Again, at the time, in the moment, out of the blue. But now, again, like I said, hindsight, it makes more sense with his character. But it does bring up an interesting conundrum. What does this do in terms of Din's personal loyalties now? Because he's been a member of the Watch. That has been his driving identity this whole season, this whole series, really. And this season began with his quest to redeem himself, wash away his transgressions, to be restored and allowed back in to the Watch. So the armorer has been his sort of authority figure and the one who is his like sort of compass. But now that Bo-Katan has come along and is basically establishing herself, because that's who Bo-Katan is. She's a member of this royal family. They are just born leaders. It's in their nature. And we've been seeing them interact, and we've arrived at the point now where he understands kind of who she is and her place and what she's trying to accomplish. And by pledging himself to her, who has his loyalty now? If it comes down to a split between Bo-Katan and the armor, if there becomes a sort of conflict in the future, which way does Din Djarin go? At any point prior to that scene, I would say the armor. Now with this scene, I don't know if he would say the armor. He might choose Bo, because he might be beginning to think about Mandalorians from a larger picture than just the Watch. But all that out of the way, it's back to plot now and moving forward to where this episode is going. So it's time to find the Great Forge. Now, again, Disney rears its head. Bo-Katan obviously would know where the forge is. The armorer would know where the forge is. But neither one suddenly, mysteriously knows where the forge is. They can't figure it out. But of course, the Mandalorians who've been there this whole time, they know where the forge is. So they're like, we can take you. Now, we've been hiding, keeping on the run on the surface to try to avoid any roaming eyes and creatures and dangers. But any one of us who've gone down into underground hasn't come back out alive. They've avoided on the whole underground, so they know where the forge obviously is, but they've been staying away because it's just way too dangerous down there, and they don't know why. But off we go. And now here's again, Disney being silly. We have these Mandalorians, again, they've been living on this planet for years, since the Purge, because the Purge, who knows how long ago that was at this point. It looks like it's at least a full, if not 2 generations earlier. And these guys have had this sort of kind of piratey, like surface gliding ship this whole time. By the looks of it, it's pretty well worn in. And then all of a sudden, this big giant creature just bursts out of the like giant rocks and destroys the ship. So this ship that has been there for years and years and years suddenly magically just boom, gets destroyed. You'd think these guys would have been a little more prepared. You can fly, you have jetpacks, you're on this big ship, yes, but how do you not have scouts in the air checking out what's ahead of you before the big, slow, lumbering ship gets there and runs into danger that is an existential threat to it? But nope. Again, plot requires smart, tactical people to temporarily become dumb, because that's the way this show goes sometimes. But before we get the destruction of this boat, before they set out, in this whole like scene on the boat where Bo's been telling them what happened, and Din Djarin pledges his loyalty to her kind of on this side, we have our confrontation between Paz Vizsla and Axe Woves. They're playing some sort of, I don't know, I guess more of the Star Wars experts will know what the game is. It's some sort of chess-like game or something. But they have different rules. So Axe Woves is like, they're making fun of Paz and the Watch for like primitive rules, that they're making up and all this stuff. And it turns into, okay, it's time to throw down between these two. And everyone's looking, and both sides are like, yep, we're going to stay out of it between you guys. And Bo-Katan is looking, the armor, Din Djarin. Oh no, the armor is up in orbit. But Bo-Katan and them are looking, and they're just all kind of staying back. And Bo realizes, she's like, okay, this had to happen. We've got to get this out of the way before we can move forward and work together as a people. So it's up to these two to sort their stuff out. Hopefully one doesn't kill the other. And it turns into a fight. Axe Woves is probably the more experienced fighter, probably the more skilled fighter, I would think. Paz Vizsla is so physically intimidating and so physically powerful that what he might lack in terms of being rough around the edges, in terms of some kind of fighting skills, and he's a very skilled fighter, but Axe Woves is someone probably with a lot more experience, because the Watch have spent a lot of their time kind of laying low as much as they can, while Axe Woves has been out there doing mercenary work, getting in scraps and fights, pretty much this whole time. But Paz Vizsla is so much bigger, so much stronger, he's able to offset Axe Woves' superior logistical and tactical abilities. And it's getting to the point where it's more and more heated, to finally just Grogu, still in the IG-12 mechanized thing, steps in between. And it's like, no, like, stop. You both you both proved yourselves, you both made your point, you're both going to stand up for your own groups, but enough. Listen to what's been said, you have to work together. And all that you can see, they all understand without it needing to be said out loud. That just Grogu, the child, getting in between them and saying, like, stop. They're able to both kind of regain their composure, and then now they can move forward, having respect for each other now. And it's like breaks that tension between these two, which breaks the tension between the two groups. And they're able to take their first sort of step together as a more sort of united people. Still a long way to go because these are very ideologically different groups of people, but it's the very first time they're taking a step together in the same direction. And then we sail off, the boat gets destroyed, there's an opening down into the caverns underneath, so they all zip right into there, and we find themselves underground. And before I forget, the armor was present at the initial landing, and Bo-Katan talking and everything and explaining what happened. She takes a bunch of the people who have the survivors on Mandalore. A lot of them are like pretty unhealthy and stuff because they've been malnourished, and so they need medical attention. So she actually takes all the ones who do need some medical attention and goes up to the fleet with them, leaving the rest of the survivors that are healthy warriors still to join Bo-Katan's group. So the armor was there for a lot of that. That's why I kept thinking, but I checked my notes, and yes, she was there, but she takes the people in need of medical attention back up into orbit. So she kind of exits the scene. And so she's not present for the final part of this episode. So they're in these caverns. They're near the Great Forge. They know that they follow this path, it'll eventually lead them there. But as they begin to start moving forward, they hear jetpacks, Mandalorian jetpacks. And at first they see these people flying, coming around the corner farther down the cavern. And they think, oh, more Mandalorian survivors. But then they quickly realize that no, Imperial troops. And they're these Imperial troopers with sort of First Order-esque helmets on. And they attack the Mandalorians. They quickly realize, firing back at them, that these Imperial armor that they're wearing is Beskar. So it's Beskar armored, jetpack wearing Imperial troops, which makes them much, much harder for the Mandalorians to kill. And they're in a tight spot, and all these Imperial troops have like the high ground because they're up in the air already moving around before the Mandalorians can try to establish positions and counterattack and all this stuff. But a big fight breaks out, and eventually they're able to kind of regroup and repel the Imperial troopers. And instead of keeping their heads and figuring out, okay, do we retreat and go back and we get more people, increase our group, or do we scout ahead cautiously? Nope. They get their blood and they chase after them, because Mandalorians, when you get them going, they are warriors. That warrior switch turns on, and they just want that. They want to keep fighting until the fight's done. and they give chase to these Imperial troopers. They run after them, they come around this corner, and then find themselves suddenly entering what looks to be an Imperial base, like a full-blown Imperial base. There's TIE bomber and TIE fighters like attached, like docked and everything in there. It's pretty massive. A whole big door like slams shut behind them and slams shut in front of them. And all the Mandalorians are trapped in this one space, except for Din Djarin. Him and one other Mandalorian were too far into the Imperial base. So when the front door shuts down, they're trapped on the other side with now arriving Imperial troopers. And then Moff Gideon comes down in this black Beskar armored with spiked horned helmet and everything. A super throwback to like that Darth Maul, like I forget what they were, Shadow Alliance or something that they were called, that the other Paz Vizsla was kind of the head of. It's kind of a part of Death Watch that became like that sort of Shadow Alliance with Maul, like basically Maul's Mandalorians, and they had all this armor and stuff. Bo-Katan joined them and kind of sided against her own people to side with Maul back then. Part of crazy stuff. Great stuff. Great storyline. He's got that look. And you start to realize, going back to the opening scene of the episode, Moff Gideon has some much grander designs for himself. And Din Djarin has been captured. The other Mandalorian is killed. Din Djarin is captured. Moff Gideon comes down. He's basically mocking Din, and he's calling out Bo, telling, okay, surrender the Darksaber to me again. You know, you guys are done, so I want my Darksaber back. Bo-Katan is like, no, you know, and she runs to the back and jabs the Darksaber into the back door, and she starts cutting it to cut a hole for them to escape, because she realizes they have to retreat, and they'll figure out a way to come back to rescue Din later. But then Moff Gideon orders the door opened up, so the front door opens, the stormtroopers attack. They're all kind of fighting each other while Bo is cutting the hole. And then they all start like one by one kind of going through the small hole. And then Paz Vizsla decides that, okay, somebody has to stay and hold these troopers back. Otherwise, we're all just going to get mowed down as we're running away. So he turns to Bo and says, go, you know, I'm staying. And she realizes that he's sacrificing himself for the rest of them to escape. And she resists it at first, but then she realizes, you know, it has to be done. A really cool moment because, one, it's Paz Vizsla being a badass and going out like a badass in a sense. But it's also he's sacrificing himself, not for the Watch. He's sacrificing himself for all of the Mandalorians. The Watch, the Night Owls, the Mandalorian survivors who had stayed on the planet all this time, that he's willing to give his life for any one of them. Seeing that next step in this evolution of what looks to be forming as a possible new way forward for the Mandalorians. And then we get a Paz Vizsla being a badass, fighting all these Imperial troopers until his gun gets so hot that he can't use it anymore, and he starts bludgeoning them with it. And he actually kills all the small group of guards who are there, because Moff Gideon had left and they had dragged Din Djarin away. But before he could escape himself, Paz Vizsla, because he's just so worn out from this whole fight, before he can even catch his breath and try to retreat, the 3 Praetorian guards come out, and they make quick work of him. 1, they're skilled way beyond him, and 2, he's so spent at this point with just fighting all these troopers by himself, so that they make quick work of him, and Paz Vizsla dies. That's pretty much how the episode 7 ends. Overall, the best episode of the season at this point. One of the better episodes, I think, of the whole Mandalorian show over 3 seasons. This is probably maybe my top 5 episodes so far of this whole series. Really well done. We got a lot of critical, important backstory here to kind of begin to explain like how all this happened, how Mandalore ended up in the state it's in, how Moff Gideon never got the Darksaber to begin with. And it sets up what looks to be a really exciting finale for this season. But overall, outside of hey, we're going to be dumb because that's what the plot calls for moments, and there weren't a lot of those. Outside of those, a very, very solid episode where a lot of important things happened. It's nice after a season of mostly kind of meandering a bit, not really finding its legs, not knowing what plot the season even is, outside of a couple little things. We finally get a serious, really good, action-packed, solid, focused episode. Episode 6, outside of like the silly cameos with Jack Black and Lizzo, which just kind of threw me out of the story. That was a really good episode as well, outside of that silly Celebrity of the Week part. The whole droid storyline and everything, and the Separatist. That was really, really interesting and really well done. And this episode is all the way through pretty solid. Very well done. It's making me feel better about this show and this season in particular. It's ending on a much higher note than some of the rocky moments we got this season. But one more episode to go, and this season will be done.